Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us on this Shabbos Eve. On the Jewish spiritual side, we're all working the path from Pesach to Shavuot. As you know, I'm forging my own developing path week by week, understanding from a spiritual, psychological perspective what I mean by Hitgalut Hashem, the revelation of the essence of the divine, how one works that out, especially with the help of Martin Buber. I hope some of you have been able to get a hold of a new edition published in 2016 that contains some of the origins and meaning of Hasidism, several of others Buber's essays, including so-called Way of Man, meaning the way of the human being, and many other fine texts. I'm focusing mostly on the Way of Man. It's really a wonderful read. I first read it in college when I did my senior thesis on Buber, and then it felt a little bit antiquated as I went through graduate school. I was introduced to other theologians, and going back to him, these many years later, it's incredible how much he's grown in the ensuing 40 years. Something about the staying power of his work. It's very refreshing to tap back into Buber as he's as a child of religious people who became secular, but having witnessed Hasidism in Eastern Europe and trying to make sense of it as a young person, and then translating it into German. And I think it was part of his contribution to humanistic psychology, and then realizing he had a unique voice and unique access to the Hasidic tradition, and more or less devoted his life to be a translator of Hasidism into what I'm going to call humanistic psychology, but far deeper than humanistic psychology, with his interest in human development, spiritual human experience, peak experiences, and so forth. He was very interested in how this plays out in Hasidic community. Not that he had any idea how we recreate that in the modern world. And also the power of narratives and stories. Most of you know that Buber's initial claim to fame was his reciting the stories of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, his wonderful tales of the Hasidic masters, early masters, and later masters, which is worth reading for everybody. And this new literary archetype called the legendary anecdote. He finally named it later on in life, and the power of Hasidism. In fact, when I was a younger person, I thought that Hasidism was telling stories about masters. It wasn't until I was studying original sources in my late 20s that I actually discovered the writings of the Hasidic masters themselves, most especially Sfat Emet, as you know. And I had never really considered the Tanya, the founding text of Chabad Hasidism, as a Hasidic text, of course, until I studied the history of Chabad. So it's a wonderful time for me, and hopefully for you, in our history, present, and future of study at Oratora. Hasidism is always a major element. It's always fresh. It's always new. It always gives profound insight. That'll be for tomorrow. We'll continue our work there. Tonight, I wanted to say a few words about Yom Hazikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut. I've gotten emails from just about every institution with which I'm connected, sending these sometimes feel like pro forma emails, and Meirav and I were thinking about composing one, and we thought, you're probably getting emails from everywhere about Israel's Memorial Day and Israel's Independence Day. So we thought we'd save that for just a few more direct words tonight. Why is this so fresh? I want to talk about Israel Independence Day for just a moment. Clearly, and a little bit of history for us to remember, when the pogroms in Eastern Europe increased in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were those who realized in a very prescient way that Jewish life in Eastern Europe was untenable, and maybe beyond Eastern Europe. This was Herzl's great realization at the Dreyfus trial. He was a completely secular Jew, a Viennese Jew covering the Dreyfus trial in 1894 in France, and was stunned that when Dreyfus was framed, unjustly convicted, that the Parisian mobs yelled, "Death to the Jews." he and others were stunned that a Jewish officer is convicted of a crime. Now we know that he was framed, and it was another officer was selling secrets to the Germans. But the response would be to kill every Jew. This was in France. This was in Paris. So Herzl realized, along with others, that Jews had to get out of Europe. Now, remember, there was immigration to the United States, but then there was the question, what about going back to our homeland? Most of you know that the region called Palestine at that time was ruled by the Turks. There were already Jewish communities there, and there began a movement after the World Zionist Organization was established to purchase mostly agricultural settlements throughout Turkish-ruled Palestine, established Jewish cities in town. And by the way, all of this with the permission and encouragement of the Ottoman Empire. When you go further back, when people talk about Israel's right to exist, it's such a bizarre question because nobody asked, by what right did the Ottoman Empire rule that region called Palestine? What right did the Ottoman Empire have to take it from the Arabs who had conquered it in the 600s? What right did the Arabs have to take it from the Byzantine Christians? What right did the Romans have in conquering it? So when everyone talks about some region either conquered or inhabited through migration, the idea of talking about the right for people to populate a territory is a very bizarre question, especially the more you know about human history and the history of human migration. Part of what Europe is now, if you look at the migratory patterns of the Goths and the Visigoths and the Gauls back and forth all across the European continent, the idea that some group was stuck in one area and that's the only area that we're permitted to live, human history is filled with migration. So the idea that Eastern European Jews could migrate to Palestine just as Arabs migrated to Palestine under the Arabs. So this whole question of the right to exist or the right of people to live somewhere is a bizarre question, because when you ask anybody what country has a right to exist, what people have a right to immigrate, especially if the government permits the immigration. So what right do people have to immigrate to America? I don't know if it's a natural right, but if the government grants the right, you might say it's what we call an entitlement, which means the government grants not a natural right, which is the Constitution, by the way, as you all know in this current debate, the Constitution does not create our rights, it protects our rights. Those are called natural rights. I'm one of those who believe that women have, for example, in the current debate today, women have a natural right as, in some non-legal sense, owners of their body, non-legal in the sense that it can't be acquired or transferred. It's a natural right. And therefore, I think abortion is a natural right. It's sad for me, but it is a natural right. So this whole idea of rights, when anybody says Israel has a right to exist, doesn't have a right to exist, it's just a strange question that has never been asked, in my mind, in the history of, in the history of human settlement. So in any case, if one wants to go to a legal right, the Ottoman Empire gave Jews the legal right to settle in Palestine. No land was stolen, no land was expropriated. It was all under the careful guidance of the Turks. Did the British have a natural right after their war with Turkey to come into possession of the former regions ruled by the Ottoman Empire? That's hard to know. But again, this is oftentimes a natural consequence of warfare, that those who win the war take over the regions of the defeated empire. Now, what the British began to do was to give different nations. By the way, the British drew the borders of Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and so forth, and the borders were drawn, and the British said, we're pulling out of the Middle East. It began in the 1930s. That nations developed in what used to be the Ottoman Empire. A remaining question for the British was the region called Palestine, where there were two groups that had a claim to the land. And again, this was for the British to work out. And when the British turned it over to the United Nations, through a vote, and again, it's hard to know, did the United Nations have a right to do this? There's really no precedent for it, for the United Nations to say, in this region called Palestine, there's going to be two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, I wish that when Israel was established, they would have called themselves the State of Israel in Palestine. The Jews in Palestine called themselves Palestinians. The Jerusalem Post was the Palestinian Post. The brigade in the British Army was called the Palestinian Brigade. The Jews in Palestine saw themselves as Palestinians. There were just a couple of different kinds of Palestinians: Jewish Palestinians, Arab Palestinians, divided into two groups: Muslim Palestinians and Christian Palestinians, and a variety of other groups. So when the United Nations decided to divide Palestine among its largest constituent populations, the Jews and the Arabs, it's very hard to go back and say the UN had no right to do it. By the way, the first country that, when Israel declared its independence on May 14th, 1948, the first country to recognize Israel on May 15th, by the way, was the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we have something that, for those of us who feel connected to the state of Israel, the land of Israel, in some ways how I'm seeing Ukrainians today. I've known many people who are of Ukrainian ethnicity, Ukrainian nationality, and they never really thought about it until there was a war to extinguish the nation of the Ukraine and engage in what seems to be mass murder of Ukrainians. Suddenly, Ukrainian national consciousness has come into being, and there was an existential question that had to be asked: shall we just let this war go, be subsumed by the Soviet Union, and have Ukrainian nationhood, ethnicity, identity wiped out? Many people recommended that, but if you know something about history, what the Ukrainians suffered under the first of all the Nazis, then the Soviet Union. I think there's something from what I understand of Ukrainian national consciousness, that does not want to be ruled and then be subject to the genocidal forces that were present both under Hitler and under Stalin. So people say, do any Ukrainians remember back that far? National consciousness is an interesting thing, but as I've spoken to the few Ukrainians with whom I'm close to talk about this, they're very conscious that there was 2 attempted genocides in the 1940s, first by by Germany and then by Stalin. In the same sense, when Israel was established, there was an attempted genocide. It's hard for us to believe it, but the 7 Arab countries round about said, if you establish yourself, we will wipe you out, we will kill every Jew and push you into the sea. The newborn state of Israel took that very seriously. And here's another similarity when people talk about the Ukrainians seemingly fighting for every inch because they know there's nowhere to go. If they lose this war, it's the end of Ukraine, probably forever. And during the War of 1948, it's remarkable that Jewish settlements never fled. It didn't matter how surrounded they were. It didn't matter the power of the army, whether it was the Egyptians, the Jordanians, Lebanese, Syrians, or the Arab Liberation Army, the local Palestinians. Not one Israeli settlement was emptied from people fleeing. They all fought and held their ground. Now, only a few were ever conquered. Yad Mordecai by the Egyptians, a few other places. You all know that in Gush Etzion, the people who surrendered were massacred. I think that was something that Israelis understood, that to surrender is to be butchered. And more or less, the Palestinian Jews, now the Israelis, decided to fight for every inch because they knew that the end of it was genocide. Now, that's something that Israelis remember. Israelis remember there was an attempted genocide and extinguishing of Jewish life in Palestine, which became the state of Israel. So when Israel has its Yom Hazikaron, its fallen soldiers and victims of terror, I know how I feel on Memorial Day. You all know I have a great love identification as being a citizen of the United States. I've served my country voluntarily, out of love for my country and the ideals of my country. For Israelis, fallen soldiers is symbolic of that which stands between Israel's existence and being an extermination. As much as I've studied American history, I don't ever remember thinking the United States was going to be exterminated and its people were going to be exterminated. It's very hard to think about a nation's citizens being exterminated. And in fact, I only know this happening one time in modern history, and that was the Jewish people in Europe, where there was an over-planned attempt to exterminate the Jewish people, and then a promise that it would be replicated in the 1940s. Prior to the 1967, this is when my family's Jewish identity sprouted, those of you who are alive and reading the papers and looking at the news in May and June of 1967, we remember hearing the same thing. Death to the Jews. It wasn't about a Palestinian state. The people were yelling death to the Jews. They had pictures of mountains of Jewish skulls, of Jews being burned to death, of Jews being driven into the sea. That's what we saw in Arab press and Arab television and Arab newspapers in May, June of 1967. On one hand, Israel had a very good army, but you never know how good your army is until it's tested on the field of battle. Israel was profoundly outnumbered. And I just remember the dread in my home. My secular Jewish mother, my father, secular Catholic who married into my mother's family, expecting to become a Jew and not realizing how much my mother wanted to be secular. Well, all of a sudden in May of 1967, we're no longer secular. We're Jewish. We're joining a synagogue. And I had never really heard of the Holocaust. It was all explained to me. And suddenly my identity shifted within a few days. And I remember it vividly. I remember our first visit to a synagogue and suddenly what it meant. Again, it happened overnight. To be part of a people where there was an attempt to exterminate this people and yet another attempt to exterminate these people, and suddenly feeling in myself a profound sense that I couldn't let this happen. I was only 12, 13 years old, but I did write a letter to the Israeli embassy volunteering to work on a kibbutz, and I said to my parents, would you allow me to go to Israel and work on a kibbutz? When I was 12, they said, sure, if they accept you, you can go. So, I never heard back. But I did end up working on a kibbutz, and by the way, one of my reasons for serving the U.S. military was I knew that the United States was the greatest guarantor of Israel's survival. So we come to Israel Independence Day. We have to be conscious that even though life goes on in Israel, Israelis are profoundly aware of that the state was not, as a famous Israeli poem says, the state was not handed to them on a silver platter. That people like you and me were living on settlements in kibbutzim and faced with an organized army with tanks and half-tracks and artillery and machine guns, fighting people basically with bolt-action rifles. And people just like you and me said, yeah, we're not pulling out. We'll fight to the end. We'll fight to the death. And this is not something that the enemy expected, that every Jewish settlement was going to fight to the death. And it was out of that courage, that resilience, that determination, that the state of Israel was born. So when we think of Israel Independence Day, I'm saying, happy birthday, Israel, 74 years, look at all this great stuff. That's not what I think about. I think about the war that happened, that began in November of 1947, low-grade war, reached a pitch in April of 1948. You know about the massacres that took place during that time. I think about the war that went on from the formal war, but went on between May of 48 and January of 49. I said it carefully to know that Israel's never had borders. There were armistice lines, and in every armistice agreement that Israel signed with its enemies to stop the shooting, the other side put a provision: this is not a border; it's only an armistice. Which is one reason I want to share with you when people talk about 1967 borders. It just shows a profound lack of knowledge of history. There were no borders in 1967. They were armistice lines signed with an enemy country that said, we're stopping shooting for now. We can pick it up anytime we want. There were no borders. So when people say, return to the 1967 borders, I say, do you mean the 1947 49 armistice lines that were never recognized as borders. And how do we know that? Because in 1967, if you look at Egypt, Syria, Jordan, other countries, they didn't recognize that Israel had borders. They said Israel's an illegitimate Zionist entity, and they were going to wipe it out. Now, when did the idea of borders happen? When Israel won the war and the fight for Palestine started up again. Again, Israel did not want this war. And they expanded their borders into something more defensible. And by the way, offered land for peace very quickly, which was rejected. So now at this very, very late date, there's this rethinking of history that Israel never stole any land from anybody. It was granted by the Turks, granted by the British, recognized by the United Nations. On May 15th, 1948, Israel was invaded by countries that threatened to destroy Israel. And the word out, that I hear like on my social media feed when I hear, the BDS movement and so forth, is just a complete bizarre forgetting and telling of history in utterly mendacious ways, which is why I want to focus on this tonight, because you probably know people who care, and just don't know the facts. By the way, a couple of years ago, I did a 2-hour talk on the history of Palestine. I included all the maps, and I had a few Muslims watching. And I studied Muslim history. I studied Palestinian books. And again, I really wanted to understand this from the Palestinian side. And I was congratulated by people that said, you really portrayed it completely accurately, what exactly happened in history. And so if you want to know, it is really tragic about that the state of Israel was not recognized in 48. The refugee problem would have never happened. And there was a profound miscalculation in attacking Israel in both 48 and in 1967. A last word I'll say about this, when people say the so-called 67 borders, which I call the 49 armistice lines, we all know the commitment of Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran to eradicate the state of Israel. And here's something that most people know very sadly. If a popular election were held in Palestine, and I'm going to include here what we call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Hamas would win the election. If Hamas wins the election, Iran wins the election. If that's an independent state, if you've ever been to Israel, there are going to be Iranian rockets, not in the Gaza Strip that have a 15, 20-second overfly. They will be actually next door to the Knesset, to the entire city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be indefensible. It will be a butchery. It will be a massacre. So when people say, go back to the armistice lines of 49, and I say, and what will protect Israel from a Hamas takeover of Palestine and therefore an Iranian takeover of Palestine? And the answer is nothing. If there was some guarantee that Israel would not be subject to butchery, I might feel a lot different about again, as an American Jewish perspective, some redrawing of the borders, but as someone who has children living in Israel and grandchildren living in Israel and my wife's entire family living in Israel, and on two borders, the southern border and the northern border, two organizations that are dedicated to the extermination of Israel and the murdering of every Jew in Israel, supported by a murderous regime aspiring to become a nuclear power. When you go to Tel Aviv, it's nice restaurants. You go to Yerushalayim, there are many wonderful institutes to study, but the underground feeling tone is something like the Ukraine today. This could all go bad very quickly, and we have to be ready to fight. And you see this in this recent spate of terror attacks. Nobody is safe. Anybody with a pistol, with an axe, with a knife can just go berserk and butcher innocent civilians going about their way. This is the reality. Now, numerically, it's not great, but symbolically, it is great. So I want to mention the fallen soldiers because they're fallen soldiers who protected the state from extermination. They're victims of terror, but they're really victims of a deep, abiding hatred of Jews. And anybody who considers him or herself Jewish, identifies with the Jewish people, or just is against hatred, is against threats of extermination. We have to take this day very seriously, I think, as people who are committed to Western ideals of democracy and peace and so forth. So I have many non-Jewish friends who understand what's at stake in Israel, just as many people who understand what's at stake in Ukraine. So just last word about that. So I see a lot of people saying, the Ukraine is a corrupt country and all kinds of different things. And the deeper thing at stake, I think, for you and me is what happens when a country as powerful as Russia, in a completely unprovoked way, invades a neighbor. Finland is not safe. Sweden isn't safe. Norway's not safe. Poland's not safe. None of these countries are safe. We don't know how far Putin's Russia and the inheritors of Putin Russia, we don't know how far they'll go. When will the line get drawn? Now people say, why should we care about Ukraine? It's hard to say. My sympathies are there, but I care more about this naked, murderous butchery happening in front of our eyes when we've seen it happen before. And I think there's something in the world consensus is saying, yeah, we might not want to send our young people to be on the border, but we'll do anything we can to help these people defend themselves, which is exactly what happened in Israel. Look at the similarities. No country sent soldiers, but people from all over the world volunteered. And many parts of the world said, we're not sending our soldiers, but you can buy weapons from us. And that's what helped Israel survive, was a willingness to allow Israel to defend itself and to allow volunteers from abroad. The Israeli Air Force was more or less established by fighter pilots from outside of the United States, South Africa, and other places. So I want to dedicate this night, I'm going to say as a Jew, as someone very tied to the state of Israel, as an American, as a citizen of the world, as someone who advocates democracy and states rooted in rights, as a person against this naked aggression to exterminate and butcher and commit genocide. It's something that I think we all have to take heart and remind ourselves and be overtly dedicated and outspoken for the security of the state of Israel. I want to say one last thing to maybe transition a bit. I'll mention give one metaphor, and then I'll close. When we work on our high holiday music, Meirav is always always looking out for music in what I call the modern Israeli revival of religious poetry and the wonderful musical arrangements that go with it. When I was growing up, it was all the popular Israeli, they say Dor HaPalmach, the Israeli dances and this really, really wonderful Israeli folk music that was born. And there was a time when everybody knew the Israeli songs. When Meirav began to show me these incredible music and these incredible compositions, I'm aware there's a spiritual revival happening in Israel that's very much rooted in the Israeli reinvestigation of the prayer book, and in many ways, these are some of the most popular songs in Israel, is the reappropriation of the music of the prayer book. In fact, one of my students, my Wednesday night class, the class on soul and spirit, is an Israeli guy who just had a heart opening. He sent to me a newish Israeli song that I played, and it was very profound and very deep. And I played it for Meirav. She said, "Yeah, I know that song. I know the guy. He's really wonderful. We just don't have all the space in the world to include every great Israeli paitan poet musician." Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is, yes, we want to defend the borders, but that's not all that Israel is. This beleaguered country with enemies on all sides. That's, I think, at a deeper level, Israel is exactly what Ahad Ha'am. There are two driving forces to establish Israel. One with Herzl, a more political idea, refuge for the Jews. Ahad Ha'am taught about a Jewish spiritual revival that could only happen with a revival of the Hebrew language and a culture rooted in our ancient and holy texts. Well, this is happening. This is happening as I speak. So I always have to remember, as worked up as I get about defending the borders and Israel's survival, I always have to remember there's a constant and deep spiritual side for what is happening in Israel. And I think one of our purposes as a community is, again, as we regain our footing in this post-COVID era, is to make sure that wonderful Israeli spiritual revival is brought to all of you as well.